A 6-year-old girl crawls through absolute darkness, dragging a weight 3 times her body mass. She has been doing this for 8 hours. She will do it for 4 more, then she will wake before dawn and do it again. Her name is Sarah Gooder. The year is 1842, and she is not alone. Over 5,000 children under 13 work in Britain's coal mines. Some are 4 years old. This is not a story about evil. This is a story about profit. The coal dust coats everything: Sarah's lungs, her hair, the inside of her mouth. She tastes it with every breath, a metallic bitterness that never goes away. The tunnel is 26 inches high. She cannot stand. She cannot turn around. She can only move forward, the leather harness cutting into her waist, the chain scraping between her legs with every movement. The cart weighs 200 pounds. Sarah weighs 42. Her knees bleed through the rags wrapped around them. The mine owners don't provide padding. Rags cost money. Children are cheaper. The going rate for a child miner in Lancashire is 3 pence per day. A candle costs 4 pence. Sarah costs less than light. She pulls. The cart moves 6 inches. She pulls again. 6 more inches. The mathematics of exploitation are simple. 1 child, 12 hours, 200 pounds of coal per trip, 8 trips per shift equals economic efficiency. The screaming pain in her spine, the permanent curvature already developing in her back, the fact that she will likely be dead before age 25, these don't appear in any ledger. Above ground, in the gas-lit mills of Manchester, a different machine devours different children. Robert Blinko is 10 years old. He stands barefoot on a floor slick with oil and cotton fibers. The spinning machine towers above him, its mechanical arms moving with hypnotic precision. 2,400 spindles, 180 revolutions per minute. Robert's job is to crawl beneath this monster while it runs, collecting loose cotton and clearing jams. The machine has no mercy for small mistakes. Last week, it took 7-year-old Thomas Bennett's entire arm. Robert watched Thomas bleed out on the factory floor. They all did. The overseer made them keep working, stepping around the spreading pool of blood, because stopping the machine costs the mill owner $12 per hour in lost production. Thomas's life was worth approximately $5, the price the mill owner paid the parish workhouse for him 6 months ago. The air in the spinning room is 84 degrees Fahrenheit, kept hot and humid so the cotton threads don't break. The windows are nailed shut. 70 children work in this room, their clothes soaked with sweat, their breath coming in short gasps. The cotton dust hangs in the air like fog, coating their lungs with every inhalation. In 10 years, half of them will be dead from respiratory disease. The mill owners call it factory consumption. Doctors call it murder. The bell rings. 5:30 a.m. 30 minutes to dress, eat, and be at your station. Robert moves on automatic now. 6 months of this routine has carved it into his muscle memory. Splash water on face. Pull on shirt still damp from yesterday's sweat. Swallow the watery oatmeal without tasting it. Run to the mill. Do not be late. Late means the strap. The overseer, Mr. Birch, carries a leather belt studded with metal rivets. He uses it with practiced efficiency. 3 strikes for being late, 5 for falling asleep at your station, 10 for attempting to escape. The children have learned to calculate punishment the way they calculate nothing else in their stolen educations. Minor infractions heal in days, major ones in weeks. Samuel Coulson, who works the station next to Robert, has scars across his entire back. Last month, he fainted from exhaustion and fell into his machine. Mr. Birch beat him unconscious for damaging the equipment. Samuel is 9 years old. The factory operates on a brutal efficiency. 2 12-hour shifts, day and night. The machinery never silent. Children from the day shift stumble out at 8:30 p.m. and within minutes, the night shift children take their places at the same machines, still warm from the previous workers' hands. In the dormitory, the beds work the same way. As one child climbs out to begin work, another climbs in, the mattress still holding the heat of the previous body. The sheets are changed once per month. The straw mattresses are never replaced. In winter, frost forms on the inside of the dormitory windows. Children wake with their breath visible in the frozen air, their lips blue, their fingers too numb to tie their shoes. The factory provides no heat. Heat costs money. Children who die from pneumonia are easily replaced. The parish workhouses of London have an endless supply. Ellis Needham, the owner of Lytton Mill, paid $5 per child for the 80 children he purchased last year. Each child generates approximately $30 worth of labor annually. After deducting the cost of food, 4, housing, 2, and the occasional doctor's visit for injuries severe enough to impact productivity, 1, Needham nets $23 profit per child per year. Multiply by 80 children, multiply by the 15 mills Needham owns. The mathematics of childhood destruction have made him a very wealthy man. At 8:00 a.m., the children get 20 minutes to eat. Thin gruel, sometimes bread, usually moldy. They eat standing up, too exhausted to care about the taste, their bodies already aching from 3 hours of work, already dreading the 9 hours still ahead. Mary Richards, age 7, works at the carding machine. The machine combs raw cotton into fine strands, its metal teeth moving in relentless circles. Mary's job is to feed raw cotton into the mechanism and remove the carded strands on the other side. The machine has no safety guards. Safety guards slow production. At 2:47 p.m., Mary's hair catches in the mechanism. The sound cuts through everything, a wet, ripping noise that somehow penetrates the thunder of the machinery. Mary screams. The machine continues its work, indifferent. It pulls. Her scalp tears away in a sheet, blood pouring down her face, her skull visible in patches where the skin has been completely removed. Mr. Birch reaches her in 5 seconds. He doesn't stop the machine. Stopping the machine requires authorization from the floor manager, and the floor manager is at lunch. Instead, Birch wraps a rag around Mary's head, ties it tight, and sends her back to work. The rag soaks through with blood in minutes, but Mary keeps working because the alternative is the strap, and the strap hurts worse than her missing scalp. She will carry those scars for the rest of her life. She is lucky. She still has her life. 300 miles north in the coal mines of Scotland, luck is measured by different standards. Ellison Jack is 6 years old. She works as a hurrier, pulling carts of coal through tunnels that measure 24 inches high. She wears a leather belt around her waist, connected by a chain to a cart that weighs 300 pounds. The chain passes between her legs. After 6 months of work, the constant friction has worn through her skin. The wounds have become infected. She cannot walk without pain, but walking is not required. Only crawling, only pulling, only surviving until the shift ends. The mine extends 400 feet below the surface. The air is thick with coal dust and methane gas. The only light comes from small oil lamps that provide barely enough illumination to see a few feet ahead. When the lamps go out, and they do regularly, the children work in total darkness, navigating by touch and memory, their hands feeling along the rough stone walls, their knees finding the familiar grooves worn into the tunnel floors by thousands of previous journeys. Cave-ins are common. In 1838, a mine collapse in Yorkshire buried 26 children alive. The mine owner calculated that a rescue attempt would cost $500 in lost production and additional cave-in risk. He sealed the tunnel instead. The children's screams could be heard for 3 days, growing progressively weaker, until finally there was only silence. Their bodies were never recovered. By 1842, the Parliamentary Commission investigating conditions in British mines had interviewed hundreds of child workers. 8-year-old Anne Ambler testified that she worked 16 hours per day with a 15-minute lunch break. She described being beaten with a thick stick when she worked too slowly. She told the commission she was afraid of the dark, afraid of the rats, afraid of the gas that sometimes leaked into the tunnels and exploded without warning. The commissioners asked her if she knew what happened to children who died in the mines. "They get left there," she said. "The rats eat them." She said it without emotion. At 8 years old, she had already learned that tears were useless. The Industrial Revolution spread its poison across the Atlantic with equal efficiency. In the factories and mills of New England, American capitalism discovered the same mathematical truth that British industrialists had learned. Children are profitable. The Lowell Mills in Massachusetts employed 800 girls between the ages of 10 and 16. The mill owners advertised the work as respectable, educational, an opportunity for young women to earn money and gain independence. The recruitment posters showed smiling girls in clean dresses, working in bright, airy rooms. The reality was 13-hour days, 6 days a week, in deafening rooms filled with cotton dust that turned the air gray and made breathing feel like drowning. The tuberculosis mortality rate among these workers was 3 times higher than the general population. The mill owners called it industrial progress. The girls called it slow suffocation. In Pennsylvania, the glass factories employed thousands of children as mold boys, carrying red-hot glass bottles from furnaces to cooling rooms in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The boys, some as young as 8, would run back and forth, their hands wrapped in wet rags that steamed and dried within minutes, the skin beneath blistering and peeling, healing and blistering again in an endless cycle of destruction. Burns were constant. Permanent scarring was universal. The work required such intense concentration that children routinely worked 12-hour shifts without breaks, sustained only by fear and the occasional sip of water. One factory owner, when questioned about the practice by a visiting journalist, responded, "These children come from poverty. We're giving them opportunity. We're teaching them the value of hard work." The value of hard work, apparently, was severe burns, permanent disfigurement, and death before age 30. Back at Lytton Mill, as the sun sets and the gas lamps flicker to life, Robert's vision begins to blur. 16 hours awake, 3 hours remaining in his shift. His hands move automatically now, tying broken threads without conscious thought, his body operating on pure survival instinct, while his mind retreats to a numb, distant place where pain and exhaustion become abstract concepts rather than immediate realities. This is when the accidents multiply. Exhaustion makes children slow. Slow children make mistakes. Mistakes cost fingers, hands, lives. Mr. Birch patrols the aisles with his strap, striking children who show signs of falling asleep. Some overseers splash cold water on children's faces. Others employ more creative cruelties, hanging weights from ears, forcing children to stand on one leg while working, anything to keep them alert and productive for the final hours of the shift. At 8:30 p.m., the bell finally rings. Robert climbs the stairs to the dormitory, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He's too tired to remove his clothes. He collapses onto the wooden bed, presses himself between two other boys, and falls into sleep so deep it's almost like dying, except he knows he will wake in 9 hours and do this all again. Tomorrow, same time, same place, same hell. But something is changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Reformers like Lord Ashley are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions in Parliament. Writers like Charles Dickens are exposing these horrors in novels that reach millions. Journalists are infiltrating factories, documenting conditions, publishing reports that shock the public conscience. The London Times runs a series of articles describing conditions in the mills. Public outrage begins to build, slowly, like pressure in a steam engine. In 1842, Parliament passes the Mines and Collieries Act, prohibiting the employment of women and children under 10 in coal mines. It's a small step. Enforcement is inconsistent. Many mine owners simply ignore the law, knowing that inspections are rare and penalties are light. But it's a crack in the foundation. The factory owners fight back with everything they have. They argue that restricting child labor will destroy British competitiveness, that it will cause economic collapse, that foreign manufacturers will undercut British prices and drive the entire industry into ruin. They insist that children benefit from the discipline and structure of factory work, that it keeps them out of trouble, that it builds character and teaches the value of honest labor. They're terrified because they know the truth. Their entire empire is built on the broken bodies of children. Without child labor, their profit margins collapse. Without child labor, they have to pay adult wages. Without child labor, they have to install safety equipment and improve working conditions. Without child labor, the Industrial Revolution itself might grind to a halt. And so the battle lines are drawn. On one side, profit, power, the unstoppable momentum of industrial progress. On the other, humanity, morality, the radical idea that children deserve childhoods. The outcome is far from certain. As Robert sleeps his fitful sleep, as Sarah crawls through her endless darkness, as Mary's scalp slowly scabs over and Ellison's infected wounds fester, the future hangs in balance. But in the factories and mines, nothing changes. Not yet. The machines keep running. The children keep suffering. And the men who profit from this misery sleep soundly in their comfortable beds, their consciences undisturbed, their bank accounts growing fatter by the day. The real horror isn't the suffering itself. It's how easily society accepts it, how thoroughly it's normalized, how efficiently it's justified, how the newspapers report factory accidents the way they report the weather. Unfortunate, regrettable, but ultimately inevitable. Because these children aren't just being exploited. They aren't just being worked to death. They're being poisoned. And in the factories that produce the matches, lighting Britain's homes, the paint coloring its ceramics, the dyes brightening its textiles, that poison has a name that will define the next chapter of industrial horror, a name that will make the cotton mills look merciful by comparison. The Poison Price, the Bryant and May factory on Fairfield Road, Bow, is a cathedral of industrial efficiency. 5 stories of brick and iron, 1,400 workers, 6 million matches produced daily. The building dominates the East End skyline, its chimneys belching yellow smoke that smells like garlic mixed with decay. Residents within half a mile can taste the phosphorus in the air, a metallic tang that coats the tongue and never quite goes away. Inside, the match-dipping room is hell with better lighting. 200 girls, most between 12 and 16 years old, stand at long wooden tables. Each table holds vats of white phosphorus paste, heated to keep it liquid, releasing fumes that shimmer in the gaslight like heat waves off summer pavement. The girls dip wooden splints into the paste, coating the tips, then arrange them in frames to dry. They do this 10,000 times per shift. Their hands move in mechanical rhythm, dip and place, breathing poison with every movement. The smell is overwhelming. Garlic and sulfur and something sweetly rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. After the first week, Sarah stopped noticing it. After the first month, she stopped tasting her food. The phosphorus had killed her sense of smell so thoroughly that everything she ate might as well be cardboard. After 6 months, her teeth began to ache. Now, 3 years later, her jaw glows in the dark. The process starts small, a toothache, easily ignored in a life full of larger pains. Then the tooth becomes loose. Then the gum around it begins to swell, turning an angry red that darkens to purple. The pain intensifies, a constant throbbing that makes sleep impossible. The jaw begins to abscess, pockets of infection forming deep in the bone. And then, in the darkness of night, the grotesque miracle. The infected bone begins to glow. White phosphorus is a remarkable substance. Discovered in 1669 by German alchemist Hennig Brand, who was trying to create gold from urine, it glows in the dark, ignites spontaneously in air above 30 degrees Celsius, and is devastatingly toxic to human tissue. When inhaled or absorbed through mucous membranes, it accumulates in the bones, particularly the jaw, where it causes necrosis. Living bone tissue dies while the victim is still alive. Dr. Thomas Oliver, examining match factory workers in the 1890s, described the progression. The disease begins with toothache and swelling of the gums. The jaw becomes tender, the gums separate from the bone, and large quantities of foul-smelling pus discharge from the mouth. The jawbone itself becomes necrotic, glowing with a greenish luminescence in the dark. Eventually, large portions of the jawbone simply die and must be surgically removed if the patient survives the sepsis that inevitably follows. Sarah Chapman knows 6 girls who died from phossy jaw. She watched Mary Ann Turner waste away over 8 months, her face gradually collapsing as the bone dissolved, the smell of decay preceding her wherever she went, until finally the infection spread to her brain and she died screaming in agony at age 16. But here's the darkest part. Sarah is one of the lucky ones. She still has most of her jaw. She can still eat. Though swallowing is agony, she can still work, which means she can still earn the 4 shillings per week that keeps her family from absolute destitution. The unlucky ones lose half their face to surgery. The unluckiest ones die, and the factory owners know. They've always known. In 1845, the Austrian government banned white phosphorus matches after documenting the disease's devastating effects. By 1872, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden had followed suit, switching to the safer red phosphorus. In 1888, the British medical journal The Lancet published a comprehensive report on phossy jaw, complete with photographs of victims whose faces had been destroyed by the disease. Bryant and May's response was to increase production. The mathematics were simple. White phosphorus matches were cheaper to produce than red phosphorus alternatives. The cost difference, approximately 1/10 of a penny per box. Bryant and May produced 6 million matches daily, generating annual profits of $200,000. Switching to red phosphorus would cost approximately $5,000 per year in additional materials. They chose profit. The girls paid with their faces. William Bryant and Frances May, the factory's owners, lived in mansions in Mayfair. Bryant's home had 18 bedrooms, a private gallery housing works by Turner and Constable, and a staff of 22 servants. May owned 3 country estates. In 1885, Bryant was knighted by Queen Victoria for his contributions to British industry. In the same year, 43 match girls died from phossy jaw. The working conditions extended beyond the poison itself. The match-dipping room was kept deliberately hot, 85 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, because the phosphorus paste needed to remain liquid. The windows were kept closed to prevent drafts that might affect the drying matches. The girls worked 12-hour shifts with a single 30-minute break. They were not allowed to eat in the workroom, but the phosphorus dust that coated every surface transferred to their hands, their food, their mouths. They literally ate poison with every meal. The factory fine system was brutal and precise. Speaking during work, 1 shilling. Arriving late, 3 shillings. Dirty feet, 1 shilling. Having a burnt match in their workbox, 2 shillings. Given that their weekly wage was 4 to 9 shillings, depending on experience, a single week of fines could erase their entire earnings. Some girls went home on Saturday with nothing at all. Annie Besant, a social activist who would become instrumental in the Match Girls' Rebellion, described visiting the factory in 1888. The girls are crowded together in hot, airless rooms, breathing poison every moment they work. Their hands are stained yellow from the phosphorus. Their breath reeks of it. Their hair and clothes are impregnated with it. They carry death on their fingertips and in their lungs, all to produce a product that could be made safely for an additional cost so small it would be invisible in the company's accounts. But the Bryant and May factory was not the only chamber of industrial poison. Across Britain and Europe, the march of progress left a trail of poisoned bodies in its wake. In the pottery factories of Staffordshire, the potter's rot claimed thousands. Workers, many of them children, ground flint for pottery glazes in poorly ventilated rooms. The silica dust they inhaled accumulated in their lungs, causing a progressive, incurable disease that made breathing feel like drowning. The average life expectancy of a pottery worker was 38 years. Many didn't live to see 30. Joshua Wedgwood II, inheritor of the famous Wedgwood pottery dynasty, wrote in his diary in 1845, "Visited the grinding rooms today. The dust is so thick one can barely see across the room. The workers are covered head to toe in white powder like ghosts. Their coughing is constant and sounds like death rattles. I have decided to close these rooms and install water grinding machinery." It took him 7 more years to actually implement the change. In those 7 years, 127 workers died from silicosis. In the hat-making factories of Luton and Denton, mercury poisoning created the Mad Hatters that Lewis Carroll would later immortalize. Hat makers used mercury nitrate to treat felt, a process that released mercury vapor into poorly ventilated workshops. The poisoning was insidious and progressive. First came tremors in the hands, the Hatter's shakes. Then personality changes, irritability, paranoia, emotional volatility. Then hallucinations, memory loss, and ultimately, death. The phrase, mad as a hatter, wasn't whimsical. It was a clinical observation. Dr. Alice Hamilton, pioneering American industrial toxicologist, documented mercury poisoning in American hat factories in 1910. I interviewed 43 hat makers. 37 showed clear signs of mercury poisoning, tremors, gum disease, emotional instability. 8 had lost all their teeth. 12 exhibited what could only be described as madness, paranoid delusions, violent outbursts, incoherent speech. The factory owners insisted there was no connection between their work and their symptoms. In the lead paint factories, the poison worked differently, but with equal devastation. Lead, that ancient poison that may have contributed to the fall of Rome, found new purpose in the Industrial Revolution. Lead paint covered the walls of every wealthy home, brightened toys in every nursery, colored the ceramics on every dinner table. And in the factories that produced it, workers breathed lead dust with every breath. Lead poisoning, unlike phosphorus or mercury, attacks the nervous system and blood. It causes anemia, kidney failure, brain damage. In pregnant women, it crosses the placental barrier, poisoning the fetus, causing miscarriages, stillbirths, and children born with severe developmental disabilities. In children who worked in lead paint factories, and there were thousands, it caused intellectual disabilities, seizures, and death. Mary Ann Walkley was 17 when she died of lead poisoning in 1863, having worked in a London lead paint factory for 5 years. The coroner's report noted, the deceased's brain was found to be severely damaged, with extensive scarring consistent with chronic lead exposure. Her kidneys had completely failed. Her blood was thin and pale, indicating severe anemia. Given the conditions of her employment, her death was entirely preventable and absolutely inevitable. The factory that employed her paid her family $5 in compensation. The foreman, who had forced her to work 16-hour shifts in unventilated rooms, faced no charges. But perhaps nowhere was the casual disregard for worker safety more evident than in the radium dial factories of the early 20th century. The Radium Girls, as they would become known, painted watch dials with luminous radium paint in factories across New Jersey and Illinois. The paint was expensive, $120 per gram, so the girls were taught to lip point their brushes, put the brush in their mouth, form a fine point with their lips, dip it in the radium paint, apply it to the dial, repeat. They did this hundreds of times per shift, ingesting radium with every brush point. The factory supervisors assured them the radium was harmless. Some girls painted their teeth and fingernails with it to glow at parties. The company president called the work perfectly safe. Within 5 years, the girls' teeth were falling out. Their jaws were disintegrating. Their bones were spontaneously fracturing. They were dying from radiation poisoning, their bodies literally decaying from the inside out while they were still alive. Grace Fryer, one of the first dial painters to sue her employer, testified in 1928. They told us the radium was harmless. They told us to put the brushes in our mouths. When we started getting sick, they told us it was syphilis, that we were immoral women. When we started dying, they told us it was our own fault. Grace would eventually win her lawsuit, but not before her jaw had been removed, her spine had collapsed, and she required leg braces to walk. She died at age 34, her body so radioactive it's still considered hazardous to this day. Back in London, in the summer of 1888, something unprecedented happened. Sarah Chapman and 1,400 of her fellow match girls went on strike. The immediate cause was petty, a fine of 1 shilling for dirty feet. But the real cause had been building for years. The poison, the fines, the 12-hour days, the glowing jaws, the dead friends, the owners' mansions versus the workers' slums, the sheer grinding injustice of it all. Annie Besant published an article in her newspaper, The Link, titled White Slavery in London, detailing the conditions at Bryant and May. The factory owners sued her for libel. The match girls in response walked out. It was the first strike in British history led entirely by unskilled female workers. The establishment was horrified. The Times called them hysterical and ungrateful. Politicians warned of social chaos if women were allowed to organize. Factory owners across London promised their own workers would face mass firings if they showed solidarity with the match girls. The match girls didn't care. They had glowing jaws and nothing left to lose. They marched through the East End, 1,400 strong, carrying signs that read, "Fairness, not phosphorus," and "We want to live." They organized picket lines, gave speeches, courted press attention. Sarah Chapman, her jaw still glowing in the shadows, stood on a crate in Trafalgar Square and told a crowd of 5,000 people, "We are dying for your convenience. Every match you strike was dipped by hands that are poisoned. Every light you enjoy comes at the cost of a girl's face. Is that a price you're willing to pay?" The public, confronted with photographs of Fosse jaw victims, was finally shocked into action. Donations poured in to support the strikers. Other unions pledged solidarity. The press coverage became increasingly sympathetic. After 3 weeks, Bryant and May capitulated. The match girls won. The end of the fine system, better ventilation in the dipping rooms, separate eating areas away from phosphorus dust, a small wage increase, the right to unionize what they didn't win, the abolition of white phosphorus. Bryant and May continued using white phosphorus for another 22 years, until the British government finally banned it in 1910. By then, Fosse jaw had claimed an estimated 11,000 victims in Britain alone. Sarah Chapman lived to age 39, her glowing jaw a constant reminder of the years she spent dipping matches. She never regretted the strike. "We showed them we weren't just hands," she told a journalist in 1912. "We showed them we were human." That mattered more than the victory itself. She died in 1945, her death certificate listing cause of death as chronic phosphorus poisoning, complications of necrotic jaw. 51 years after leaving the factory, the poison was still killing her. The match girls' strike became a watershed moment in labor history, inspiring women workers across Britain to organize and demand better conditions. But the broader problem, the systematic poisoning of workers in the name of profit, continued unabated. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that Victorian society didn't want to face. The entire Industrial Revolution was built on poison. The bright colors of Victorian wallpaper came from arsenic. The white paint on their homes came from lead. The matches lighting their lamps came from phosphorus. The felt in their hats came from mercury. Every convenience, every innovation, every marker of progress was paid for with someone's health. The factory owners knew, the doctors knew, the politicians knew, and they chose profit anyway. In 1895, Thomas Oliver published his comprehensive study, Dangerous Trades, documenting occupational diseases across British industry. His findings were damning. An estimated 100,000 workers were suffering from preventable industrial poisoning. The remedies were known, tested, and affordable. The only obstacle was corporate unwillingness to sacrifice profits for safety. Parliament's response was to form a committee to study the issue. The committee met for 7 years and produced a 400-page report recommending voluntary compliance with safety standards. Nothing changed. In the phosphorus factories, jaws continued to glow. In the pottery works, lungs continued to fill with silica. In the paint factories, blood continued to thin with lead. In the hat works, minds continued to unravel with mercury madness. The poison price of progress, paid in full by those who had no choice but to work or starve. As Sarah Chapman lay dying in 1945, Britain was emerging victorious from World War II. The newspapers celebrated industrial production, the factories that had armed the nation, the workers who had saved democracy. No one mentioned that many of those workers were dying from the materials they'd been forced to handle. No one mentioned that the same corporations celebrated for their wartime production had spent decades poisoning their peacetime workers with impunity. Progress had a price. Some people paid it with their labor. Others paid it with their lives. But the people who profited never paid at all. The glowing jaw in the darkness wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was a prophecy, a warning that the machines humanity had built to improve life were also perfectly capable of destroying it, and that the men who owned those machines would choose profit over people every single time, until forced to do otherwise. The question wasn't whether the poison would stop. The question was how many more would have to glow in the dark before anyone with power decided to care. But caring about poison was one thing. Preventing the catastrophes that killed hundreds in minutes, that would require something more. When the ground gave way, the morning of January 10, 1860, began like any other at the Pemberton Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts. 900 workers, most of them young women and girls, filed through the gates at 6:30 a.m., their breath visible in the frozen air. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the mill would be warm, heated by the friction of 2,700 mechanical looms running at full capacity. By 5:00 p.m., 145 of them would be dead. The building was 5 stories of brick and cast iron, 280 feet long, 84 feet wide. It had been constructed in 1853 by cheap contractors who substituted inferior materials to maximize profit. The supporting columns were cast iron filled with rubble instead of solid metal. The beams were undersized. The foundation was inadequate for the weight it carried. Every structural engineer who examined the plans warned the owners, "This building is dangerous." The owners built it anyway. At 4:45 p.m., a sound like thunder rolled through the weaving room. Mary Armitage, 17 years old, looked up from her loom. The floor was vibrating, not the normal vibration of machinery. Something different, something wrong. The gas lamps hanging from the ceiling began to swing. Workers at the windows saw the brick walls rippling, actually rippling like water. Then the columns snapped. Cast iron, when it fails, doesn't bend, it shatters. And on that freezing January afternoon, the columns supporting 900 workers and 2,700 tons of machinery shattered like glass. The building didn't collapse, it exploded downward. 5 floors of brick, iron, wood, and human beings compressed into a 15-foot-high mountain of wreckage in less than 10 seconds. Workers on the upper floors fell through space, through the collapsing floors below them, into the basement. The sound was indescribable, a roar of breaking beams, shattering brick, screaming machinery, and 900 human voices crying out in terror. And then silence. For perhaps 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the screaming began. Survivors clawed their way out of the wreckage, bleeding, broken, searching for friends and family. Mary Armitage found herself pinned under a beam, her legs crushed, unable to move. Around her, hundreds of workers were trapped in similar positions, held fast by tons of debris. Many were conscious, crying out for help. Some were impaled on broken beams or shattered looms. Others were buried so deep that only their voices betrayed their locations. The town of Lawrence mobilized immediately. Within minutes, hundreds of citizens were at the site, pulling away debris with their bare hands, forming bucket brigades to pass rubble away from the wreckage. Doctors arrived and began treating the injured on the street. The winter darkness was falling, so workers brought lanterns and torches. The lanterns and torches were a mistake. At 6:30 p.m., the gas lamps that had been burning inside the collapsed building ignited the debris. The wreckage, soaked with machine oil and filled with cotton fiber, erupted into flames. The screaming intensified beyond imagination. Hundreds of workers were still trapped alive in the wreckage. The fire swept through the debris, and those who couldn't escape burned to death while rescuers stood helpless, listening to their screams. Workers pinned by debris that would have taken hours to remove were consumed by fire in minutes. Mary Armitage, her legs crushed, watched the flames approach. Rescuers tried desperately to free her, but the beam wouldn't budge. She died screaming, begging them to kill her rather than let her burn. Reverend Alonzo H. Quint, who witnessed the fire, wrote, "The scene was one of indescribable horror. Men and women trapped in the wreckage, calling out to us by name, begging us to save them, watching the flames approach. And we could do nothing. We stood there, listening to their screams as they burned alive, unable to reach them, unable to help them. I have seen war. I have seen battlefield deaths, but I have never witnessed suffering like this." The fire burned for 3 hours. When it finally died down, rescuers resumed pulling bodies from the wreckage. Many were burned beyond recognition. Some were still in the positions they died in, hands reaching upward, mouths open in silent screams. The final death toll was 145, with another 166 severely injured. The investigation that followed revealed stunning negligence. The building's owner, George Howe, had been warned repeatedly about structural deficiencies. The columns were filled with rubble and bricks instead of solid iron, reducing their load-bearing capacity by 70%. The beams were made from inferior cast iron that contained too much sulfur, making them brittle and prone to sudden failure. The foundation was built on marshy ground without proper reinforcement. The construction had saved Howe approximately $6,000. The lawsuit settlements cost him $80,000, but he never faced criminal charges. No one did, because in 1860, there were no building codes, no safety regulations, no legal requirement that structures be built to any particular standard. If workers died because a building collapsed, that was regrettable, but not criminal. The Pemberton Mill disaster was horrifying, but it was not unique. On September 30th, 1911, the Hongkaeko coal mine in Manchuria, China, experienced what remains the deadliest mining disaster in recorded history. A gas explosion, followed by a coal dust explosion, followed by fire, killed 1,549 miners in less than 30 minutes. The mine had no ventilation system. Gas detectors had been removed because they slowed production. Emergency exits had been sealed to prevent theft of coal. When the explosion occurred, miners had no escape route. Those who survived the initial blast suffocated in the smoke. Those who survived the smoke were burned alive when the coal itself ignited. Rescue attempts were abandoned after 12 hours because the mine was still burning. The mine's Japanese owners blamed Chinese negligence. No one was prosecuted. The mine reopened 6 weeks later. In America, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 became a watershed moment in labor history. But the horror of that day deserves to be remembered in full detail. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in New York City. On March 25, 1911, 500 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, were at their sewing machines when fire broke out on the 8th floor. The cause was never definitively determined. Most likely, a dropped cigarette ignited fabric scraps that littered the floor. The scraps ignited the hanging patterns. The patterns ignited the finished garments. Within minutes, the entire 8th floor was engulfed. The workers ran for the exits and discovered that most of them were locked. The factory owners, Max Blunk and Isaac Harris, routinely locked the exit doors to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing fabric. There were 4 possible escape routes from the 8th floor. One door was locked, one opened inward and was immediately blocked by panicking workers pressing against it. One led to a fire escape that would soon collapse under the weight of people trying to use it, and one led to a stairwell already filled with smoke. The women had less than 15 minutes to escape. Some made it to the 9th floor, only to find that floor also engulfed in flames. Others crowded onto the fire escape, a flimsy iron structure that had never been tested for weight capacity. It held approximately 40 people before the bolts tore out of the wall and the entire structure collapsed, dropping the women 9 stories to their deaths. On the 10th floor, some workers made it to the roof and crossed to an adjacent building, but most of the workers on the 9th floor and many on the 8th found themselves trapped. The windows became their only option. William Shepard, a reporter for the United Press who witnessed the fire from the street below, wrote, "I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud dead, thud dead, thud dead, 62 thud deads. The women jumped from windows 100 feet above the street. Some jumped alone. Some jumped holding hands in groups of 2 or 3. Some burned to death in the windows before they could jump. Their bodies hit the pavement with such force that they broke through the iron vault covers protecting the basement, crashing through to the level below. Fire department ladders only reached the 6th floor. The fire hoses only reached the 7th. The women on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors were beyond reach. The fire burned for less than 30 minutes. 146 workers died. The youngest victim was 14-year-old Kate Leone. The oldest was 48-year-old Providenza Pano. 24 were men. The rest were women and girls. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were charged with manslaughter. Their defense argued that they didn't know the doors were locked, that the workers themselves had requested the doors be locked to prevent theft, that the fire was an unavoidable accident. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before acquitting them on all charges. 2 years later, Blank was arrested again for locking factory doors in violation of new safety laws that had been passed in response to the Triangle Fire. He was fined $20. The Triangle Fire galvanized the labor movement and led to comprehensive factory safety reforms. But those reforms came too late for the 146 dead, and they came only because the horror was so public, so visible, so undeniable that society could no longer ignore it. Other disasters remained hidden, buried literally and figuratively, their victims forgotten. The Monongah mining disaster of December 6, 1907, in West Virginia, killed between 362 and 367 miners. The exact number was never determined because the company didn't keep accurate records of who was underground. The explosion was so powerful, it destroyed the ventilation system, filled the mine with carbon monoxide, and rendered rescue impossible. Rescuers could hear trapped miners knocking on pipes deep underground, signaling they were alive. But the gas levels made entry impossible. The knocking continued for 3 days before it finally stopped. The official cause was listed as gas explosion. The unofficial cause was that the mine's ventilation system was deliberately inadequate because a proper system would have reduced profits. The mine's owner, Consolidation Coal Company, paid $150 to the family of each dead miner and faced no criminal charges. In Britain, the Sanganid Colliery disaster of October 14, 1913, killed 439 miners and 1 rescuer, making it the worst mining disaster in British history. The explosion was caused by methane gas ignition, but the subsequent investigation revealed systematic safety violations. The mine had inadequate ventilation, no gas testing protocols, no explosion-proof lighting, and a culture of ignoring safety warnings to maximize coal production. Edward Shaw, the mine's manager, was fined $24 for safety violations. That was $24 total, not per victim. The fine represented approximately 0.01% of the mine owner's annual profits. These disasters shared common features: inadequate safety measures to maximize profits, workers trapped with no escape routes, management that prioritized production over protection, and minimal or non-existent legal consequences for those responsible. But perhaps the most damning common feature was that every single disaster was preventable. The engineering knowledge existed, the safety equipment was available, the protective measures were known. The only obstacle was that safety cost money, and corporations consistently chose profit over people's lives. After the Pemberton Mill collapse, engineers published detailed recommendations for building safety. Most factory owners ignored them. After the Triangle Fire, New York passed comprehensive safety laws. Other states declined to follow suit. After the Monongah explosion, mining safety experts outlined necessary ventilation improvements. Most mine owners implemented them only when legally forced to do so. The pattern was consistent and damning. Change came only after disaster, only after public outrage, only after the deaths became too numerous and too public to ignore. And even then, change came grudgingly, slowly, with corporations fighting every safety measure as an unbearable burden on their profits. In the decades following these disasters, labor unions, progressive reformers, and workers themselves gradually forced improvements. Building codes were enacted, safety regulations were implemented, inspections became mandatory. Workers gained the right to refuse unsafe work. The disasters that had claimed thousands of lives led, eventually, to protections that saved millions more. But those protections came at an extraordinary price, paid in full by workers who burned, suffocated, or were crushed because their lives were worth less than the cost of a fire escape, a ventilation system, or an unlocked door. The ground gave way beneath them, and society watched them fall, and only after they hit bottom did anyone think to ask whether the fall could have been prevented. The answer was always yes. The tragedies were always preventable. The deaths were always unnecessary. But prevention required treating workers as human beings rather than production units. And for the men who owned the factories and mines, that was a cost too high to bear, until the workers themselves decided they had nothing left to lose. Until they picked up their tools, walked out of the mines, and said, "No more." The ground had given way beneath them. Now it was time to make the ground shake beneath their oppressors. The long fight back. The photograph was taken on April 20th, 1914 in Ludlow, Colorado. It shows the remains of a tent colony, charred canvas, blackened earth, and in the foreground, a pit dug beneath one of the tents. Inside that pit, investigators found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children. They had suffocated during a fire that consumed the camp while Colorado National Guard soldiers and company gunmen fired into the fleeing miners and their families. The Ludlow Massacre, as it became known, was not the beginning of the labor struggle, but it was the moment when the violence became too public, too obvious, too damning for American society to ignore. The fight back had started decades earlier in the coal mines and textile mills where children glowed with phosphorus and workers suffocated on silica dust. It started with small acts of defiance, work slowdowns, whispered conversations, the careful organization of the first unions in the face of corporate violence and state repression. The corporations and their allies fought back with every tool available: strikebreakers, private armies, corrupt police, complicit judges, and, when necessary, the full force of state military power. Mother Jones, the legendary labor organizer who was in her 70s during the Ludlow crisis, described the coal company's tactics. Medieval West Virginia, with its tent colonies on the bleak hills, with its grim men and women. When I get to the other side, I shall tell God Almighty about West Virginia. She was talking about the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike of 1912-1913, where coal companies evicted 10,000 miners and their families from company housing in the middle of winter, forcing them to live in tent colonies. When the miners tried to organize, the coal companies hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private army of thugs who terrorized union organizers, beat strikers, and operated an armored train called the Bull Moose Special that would roll through camps firing machine guns into the tents where miners' families slept. The miners fought back. With hunting rifles and handguns, they engaged in running gun battles with company guards. The conflict escalated until Governor Henry Hatfield declared martial law and sent in the state militia. The official death toll was 50. The actual number was likely much higher, as many bodies were buried secretly or dumped in the river. The coal companies won that strike. The miners went back to work under the same conditions, with the same poverty wages, facing the same dangers underground. But something had changed. The miners had seen that they could fight, that they could resist, that they didn't have to simply accept their exploitation as inevitable. And across America, other workers were learning the same lesson. In Lawrence, Massachusetts, the same city where the Pemberton Mill had collapsed 50 years earlier, textile workers went on strike in January 1912. The Bread and Roses strike, as it became known, involved 25,000 workers, men, women, and children of over 40 different nationalities, speaking 25 different languages. The strike was sparked by a wage cut. When Massachusetts passed a law limiting women and children to 54 work hours per week, the mill owners responded by cutting everyone's wages proportionally. Workers who had been earning $8.76 for 56 hours of work would now earn $8 for 54 hours. The mill owners apparently believed that workers would simply accept this. They were wrong. On January 11, 1912, Polish women in one mill shut down their looms and walked out. Within hours, the walkout had spread to every mill in the city. By the next day, 25,000 workers were on strike in the middle of a Massachusetts winter. The mill owners brought in strikebreakers. The strikers formed picket lines. The police attacked the picket lines with clubs. The strikers fought back. The mill owners requested military assistance. Governor Eugene Foss sent in the state militia, 400 soldiers with bayonets, to break a strike of textile workers. What happened next shocked the nation. On January 29th, during a confrontation between police and strikers, 20-year-old Annie Lopizzo was shot and killed. Police blamed the strikers. Strikers blamed the police. 2 strike leaders were arrested and charged with her murder, though evidence later proved they were nowhere near the shooting. But the killing galvanized support for the strike. Donations poured in from unions across the country. The industrial workers of the world sent organizers, including the legendary Joe Etta and Arturo Giovannitti. And the strikers, facing starvation as the strike dragged on, made a decision that would turn public opinion in their favor. They started sending their children away. On February 10th, over 100 children of strikers were sent by train to supporters in New York City, where they would be housed and fed until the strike ended. Newspapers published photographs of the children, thin, poorly dressed, obviously malnourished, arriving at Grand Central Station. Middle-class Americans who had paid little attention to labor disputes were shocked by visible evidence of how textile workers lived. The mill owners panicked. On February 24th, when strikers tried to send another group of children to Philadelphia, Lawrence police met them at the train station. According to multiple witness accounts, police officers beat women holding children, clubbed pregnant mothers, and arrested 35 people, including children as young as 4 years old. The brutality was captured by newspaper photographers. The images appeared in papers across the country. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional hearings were held. Testimony revealed the conditions in Lawrence mills, children working 60 hours per week for wages that couldn't feed a family, workers living in squalid tenements owned by the mill companies, entire families trapped in a cycle of debt to company stores. After 10 weeks, the mill owners capitulated. The strikers won wage increases ranging from 5% to 20%, overtime pay, and improved conditions. More importantly, they proved that unskilled immigrant workers, dismissed by both corporate bosses and the established labor movement as impossible to organize, could unite across language barriers and win. The Lawrence strike became a model for industrial organizing, but it was the disaster at Ludlow 2 years later that finally forced federal action on worker safety. The Colorado coal miners' strike began in September 1913, when 11,000 miners walked out demanding union recognition, better wages, enforcement of safety laws, and an end to the company store system that kept workers perpetually in debt. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., whose family controlled the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, refused to negotiate. The company evicted striking miners from company housing. The United Mine Workers set up tent colonies to house the strikers and their families. The largest colony was at Ludlow, where 200 people lived in tents through the winter of 1913 to 1914. The coal companies hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, the same thugs who had terrorized West Virginia miners. These hired guns, along with company guards and armed strikebreakers, conducted raids on the tent colonies, shooting into the camps at night, beating union organizers, terrorizing women and children. The miners armed themselves and fought back. Gun battles became common. Several people on both sides were killed. The situation was spiraling toward open warfare. On April 20th, 1914, the Colorado National Guard surrounded the Ludlow tent colony. Ostensibly, they were there to keep the peace. In reality, many guardsmen were coal company employees who had been deputized specifically to break the strike. What happened that day is disputed in details, but clear in outcome. The National Guard set up a machine gun on a ridge overlooking the camp. Around 10:00 a.m., shooting began. The miners returned fire. Women and children ran for cover. Some hid in pits that had been dug beneath the tents as a defense against the cold and the previous shooting raids. The battle continued all day. As evening approached, the guardsmen set fire to the tents. The flames spread rapidly through the canvas colony. Families tried to flee, but machine gun fire forced them back. Some managed to escape into the surrounding hills. Others stayed in their underground pits, hoping to wait out the fire. They suffocated instead. The fire consumed the oxygen in the pits. The next morning, investigators found the bodies. 2 women and 11 children huddled together in the darkness, dead from smoke inhalation. The total death toll at Ludlow was at least 21, including the 13 who died in the pit. But the violence didn't end there. Miners across Colorado, enraged by the massacre, armed themselves and attacked company facilities. Over the next 10 days, the Colorado Coalfield War resulted in at least 50 more deaths before federal troops arrived to restore order. The Ludlow Massacre became a national scandal. Newspapers published photographs of the burned tent colony and the pit where the children died. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. was called to testify before Congress. Under intense questioning, he maintained that he knew nothing about conditions in Colorado and had merely trusted his managers to handle the situation appropriately. The hearings revealed that Rockefeller's managers had systematically violated safety regulations, operated company stores that kept workers in perpetual debt, hired thugs to intimidate union organizers, and armed company guards who had participated in the massacre. Rockefeller expressed regret, but claimed no personal responsibility. Public opinion turned decisively against him. For the first time, the violence inherent in the industrial system was undeniable, photographed, and impossible to dismiss as Union propaganda. The same middle-class Americans who had been shocked by photographs of starving children in Lawrence were now confronted with images of children suffocated in pits, while National Guard machine guns fired into their families. The pressure for reform became irresistible. In the years following Ludlow, a wave of labor legislation swept through state governments and eventually reached the federal level. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 exempted unions from antitrust prosecution and limited the use of injunctions against strikes. The Keating-Owen Act of 1916 prohibited the interstate sale of goods produced by child labor, though the Supreme Court would strike it down 2 years later as unconstitutional. But the most significant changes came from state governments responding to disasters like Triangle and scandals like Ludlow. New York created the Factory Investigating Commission, led by Francis Perkins, who would later become Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt. The commission spent 3 years investigating working conditions and produced a series of reform laws that became models for other states. These laws required fire escapes on factory buildings, mandated unlocked exits during working hours, established maximum working hours for women and children, created factory inspection systems with real enforcement power, prohibited child labor and dangerous occupations, required basic safety equipment in mines and factories. The reforms weren't gifts from enlightened leadership. They were extracted through decades of strikes, protests, organizing, and the deaths of thousands of workers whose suffering finally became too public to ignore. In Britain, the Match Girls' strike of 1888 had begun the process. The Factory Acts of the 1890s and early 1900s gradually expanded protections, though enforcement remained weak. The Coal Mines Regulation Act of 1908 mandated safety measures, though mine owners often ignored them until disasters forced compliance. The pattern was consistent across industrialized nations: resistance by workers, violence by companies and state forces, disaster that shocked the public conscience, grudging reforms that saved lives but came decades too late for those who had already died. By 1920, most industrialized nations had basic worker protections, limits on child labor, safety requirements for factories and mines, restrictions on working hours, and the legal right to form unions. These protections weren't universal or consistently enforced, but they represented fundamental changes from the unchecked exploitation of the early Industrial Revolution. The cost of these reforms can be calculated. In Britain alone, workplace deaths declined from approximately 4,500 per year in 1900 to fewer than 1,000 per year by 1930, despite massive increases in the number of workers. Similar patterns appeared across Europe and America. The reforms saved hundreds of thousands of lives over the following decades. But they came too late for Sarah Gooder, crawling through coal mines at age 6. Too late for Robert Blinko, breathing cotton dust at age 10. Too late for Sarah Chapman and the 11,000 other women whose jaws glowed with phosphorus poisoning. Too late for the 145 who burned at Pemberton Mill, the 146 who died at Triangle, the 149 who suffocated at Honkeco, the 21 who died at Ludlow. The reforms came too late for the estimated 100,000 to 150,000 workers who died from preventable industrial accidents and occupational diseases during the half-century between 1850 and 1900 in Britain alone. Too late for the similar numbers who died in America, France, Germany, Belgium, and every other industrializing nation where profits mattered more than people. Mother Jones, reflecting on her decades of organizing work, said in 1925, "I have seen the bitter poverty of children who toil through the day, who have no education, who have no play. I have watched them grow bent and crooked, old before their time. I have seen them killed, maimed, poisoned, and all this that a few men might grow rich beyond the dreams of avarice." She was 93 years old when she died in 1930. She had spent 60 of those years fighting for workers' rights, surviving assassination attempts, enduring arrests, witnessing violence and death. She lived long enough to see basic protections established, though not long enough to see them become universal. The fight wasn't over. It never really is. Each generation of workers has to defend the protections won by previous generations and push for new ones. In the 1930s, it was the fight for Social Security and the right to collective bargaining. In the 1960s, it was the fight for civil rights and workplace anti-discrimination laws. In the 1970s, it was the establishment of OSHA and environmental protections. And in each generation, the same arguments resurface: that regulations hurt business, that safety measures are too expensive, that workers are trying to get something for nothing, that the market should decide these issues without government interference. The ghosts of Ludlow, Triangle, and Pemberton Mill have an answer to those arguments. The answer is written in the photographs of burned tent colonies, collapsed factories, and children jumping from windows. The answer is counted in the 100,000 preventable deaths, the millions of preventable injuries, the incalculable suffering inflicted when human beings are treated as production units rather than people. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world, creating wealth and technological progress beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. But that transformation was built on a foundation of human suffering. Children in mines, women breathing poison, men crushed in collapsing buildings, all sacrificed to the logic of profit maximization. The long fight back was the effort to force society to acknowledge that workers are human beings deserving of basic protections, that children deserve childhoods, that no amount of profit justifies poisoning, maiming, or killing the people who create that profit. It took decades of organizing, countless strikes, numerous disasters, and thousands of deaths before those principles became law. And even then, the laws came with loopholes, weak enforcement, and constant attempts to roll back protections in the name of economic efficiency. But the fight achieved something fundamental. It established that society has an obligation to protect workers, that safety isn't a luxury, but a right, and that human dignity matters more than profit margins. The children who once glowed with phosphorus in the darkness now have protections. The workers who once burned in locked factories now have fire escapes and unlocked doors. The miners who once suffocated in unventilated shafts now have safety equipment and emergency protocols. These protections exist because workers fought for them, because they organized despite the violence, because they struck despite the hardship, because they refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable or necessary. The long fight back transformed the Industrial Revolution from a nightmare of exploitation into a system that, however imperfectly, recognizes the fundamental humanity of workers. That transformation didn't happen because factory owners became enlightened. It happened because workers forced change, paid for it with their lives, and refused to stop fighting until society acknowledged their basic right to safety, dignity, and life itself. The price was terrible. The victory was incomplete. But the fight was necessary, and the fight continues